Hello, everyone. As director of the UBC School of Nursing, I am really pleased to welcome you to our 53rd annual Marion Woodward Lecture. Livecast virtually again for the second time in the history of the series, due of course to the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. The Mr. and Mrs. P.A. Woodward Foundation has generously supported the annual Marion Woodward Lecture since 1969. And in fact, it's the only event that Mrs. Marion Woodward allowed to have her name attached to. I would like to start our meeting today by acknowledging that I am speaking to you today from the UBC Point Grey campus, which is on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. And I'm particularly grateful that our work toward truth and reconciliation and addressing the calls to action that Indigenous people have made over the last years are something that we are working together with Musqueam peoples and with the other Coast Salish peoples around this region. And that our relationship with Musqueam peoples is a work in progress that is beginning. And so I'd like to invite Elder Thelma Sogan, a respected elder of the Musqueam Nation, to share a territorial welcome with us.
Thank you, Doctor. My name is Selma Stogan. My English name is Selma Stogan. My Hmong name is Lochliw, which is handed down to me on my mother's side from my grandmother. I'd like to start off by just saying a little bit about myself, first of all. I'm a great-granddaughter of Simumano, who is hereditary chief of this area. And so I've been really putting it out there lately because our elected chiefs have been noticed a lot more than our hereditary chief. It seems like my grandfather and so on have been forgotten about. And so I just want to remind people who we are and where we're from. I would like to start off by welcoming you all, first of all, to the Musqueam territory, the unceded territory of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and the Squamish people. And I would also like to put my hands up to each and every one of you because it's so important. Nursing, I was just speaking to the doctor and I was asking, is everybody nurses? And she says there are some that are still coming up to be nurses. So my hands are up to each and every one of you who are nurses, and those of you who are coming to be nurses, and those of you who've already been in the health industry for several years, because right now, because of the pandemic, we so need you all. And it's just so grateful to know that all of you are striving towards this goal. And so I'm really praying for each and every one of you to really strive for that goal, make it, and continue on helping each and every one of our people. Haichka, all my relations.
Thank you, Elder Thelma, for your kind words of welcome. And now I would like to invite my colleague, Dr. Sabrina Wong, Professor and Associate Director of Research in the UBC School of Nursing, to introduce this year's keynote speaker, Dr. Denise Wilson, a professor in Māori Health who joins us remotely today from New Zealand, where it's already tomorrow.
I guess I can take my mask off now. Yay. Okay. Welcome, everyone, to the Marion Woodward Lecture. So aligned with nursing's ethical obligations to end systemic racism and promote equity and safety for the health and well-being of Indigenous peoples, this year's Marion Woodward Lecture and Symposium complements a wider array of strategies that the UBC School of Nursing is undertaking in educating nurses to mitigate the harms and actively work to end anti-Indigenous racism and discrimination in healthcare. I'm very pleased to be able to introduce, albeit remotely, this year's keynote speaker, Dr. Denise Wilson, Professor of Māori Health, Associate Dean of Māori Advancement in the Faculty of Health and Environmental Sciences, Co-Director of Auckland University of Technologies, Taupua, Waiora Māori Research Center, and excuse my pronunciations. Dr. Wilson's research focuses on wano violence, equitable health service engagement for Māori, cultural responsiveness, and workforce development. She's a fellow in the College of the Nurses Eritrea of New Zealand, the American Academy of Nurses, and the Royal Society to, oh man, I'm gonna get these wrong, Tapaparangi, for her contributions to research and policy related to Indigenous and Māori health and wanu violence. So it is with great pleasure that I pass the mic to Dr. Denise Wilson, who is on our screen.
Can you see that? Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Tēnā koutou kua hui hui runga e te kaupapa o tēnei wā rā. Te mana whenua, tangata Masqueam o tēnei rohi, ngā mihi Thelma Stobam, mō mihi whakatau. Tēnā koutou ki tangata o University of British Columbia. Ka nui te mihi, ka nui te aroha kia koutou katoa. Kei te hari, kei te kua, te nāko ki te e koutou. Nō reira, e te rama e hoku hohi mā. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. So that is just a greeting to you all, but I want to pay particular respects to the people of the Musqueam people that this gathering is being held on, and to Elder Thelma Stogum for her opening of this 53rd Marion Woodward Lecture. So I just want to say, so I whakapapa to the Tainui waka, which is in the Waikato in the central North Island. Kareori is my mountain, which is here on the left-hand side of your screen, and Whangaroa is the water, which is commonly known as Raglan, that I relate to. Ngāti Tahinga is my hapu, or sometimes people call it sub-tribe, and Pukerewa and Weraroa are my marae. So this is one of my marae here, Weraroa, and I am Denise Wilson. So I'm very honoured to be here today. I want to start with this whakatauki here, which really speaks to the importance of us. Somebody's not being able to follow me. Is that a little bit better? So I'll just go back to that. I want to talk a little bit about this whakatauki here, or proverb, which really speaks to the importance of how, for Indigenous people, our past is intertwined with our present and our future. And we walk backwards into our future with our eyes fixed on the past. So in order to understand where Indigenous nursing is today, we also need to understand some of the histories of Indigenous people. And that's really important. I just want to say that the rhetoric, racism and realities of Indigenous nurses is a bit of a hot topic of mine. And here in Aotearoa, we're just going through a significantly big change in our health system, of which we will now have a dedicated Māori Health Authority. And so that's raised a lot of issues around our Indigenous health workforce. So, but in order to move forward into the future, we do have to look at the undergrowth that nursing sits upon, particularly nursing leadership, so that we can allow the new shoots of flax, in this case, to grow and come away. So hopefully this will all unfold and make it a little bit clearer for you as we go away. Wilkinson states that few problems have ever been solved by ignoring them. And I think for too long, Indigenous nurses have been subject to a lot of rhetoric around improving outcomes for them, but also they face racism oftentimes on a daily basis in some form or another. So Wilkinson talks about uses a metaphor of an old house with its peeling paint and imperfections that we can mend. But it's the bones of the house that are often go unseen unless the layers are stripped away and then exposed. So often that old house survives with new layers of paint and wallpaper, but its bones remain intact. But it is these bones that dictate the structure of the house. The bones of the house of humanity that sets the hierarchy, whereby some people who live in it are valued more than others. And this hierarchy that Wilkinson refers to depends upon colour and race. The lighter the skin colour, the more valued and accepted in society we are. And I want you to think about the house of nursing and its bones, particularly regarding where Indigenous nurses and peoples sit in this hierarchy. Here in Aotearoa, COVID-19's really highlighted, I guess, the bones in our country around and where Indigenous nurses and doctors and providers of health services have really sit. Right from when the pandemic hit New Zealand in March last year, Indigenous people were really highlighting how it needed to be managed, because we know historically that with the Spanish influenza, it killed our people 7 times more than others living in New Zealand. And more recently, the H1N1 virus killed Māori at a rate of 3.5 times. Fast forward to now, and this year, and more recently, we have arrived at a point where it's been decided that we can no longer just focus on an elimination strategy, which has served us well and enabled us to be free during most of this pandemic. But going forward, we're going to have to learn to live with COVID. And in order to do that, our government has set a 90% vaccination rate. So we have been saying for quite some time that the universal approach is not going to reach our people. So it's only probably in the last 4 to 5 weeks that there has been a recognition that the vaccination rollout is not reaching a lot of our people, and it's going to compromise getting to that 90% vaccination rate across the country. So it is really important that we think about, how we start clearing out that undergrowth. And I think nursing has a role to play in this as well, particularly around having to understand better the rhetoric and racism and the realities of Indigenous peoples at the hands of nurses. It is about peeling back those layers, particularly of racism, that have become part of our way of being, and oftentimes we don't even realise it. So, you know, colonization is a deliberate agenda, and this is our mountain that we whakapapa to, that we connect to. It overlooks the lands that our people used to occupy. But, you know, our reality was we were displaced from our lands by the forcible confiscation by the British of our lands. And so our hapu, a lot of our hapu have been displaced wide and far and have become quite disconnected. So, but that process takes away our place to stand in the world. You know, there was mass depopulation through infectious diseases, warfare. The colonization disrupted our family and social structures. So the really protective factors of our culture that guided the way in which we looked after one another were removed. A lot of our children were taken and put into state care. And I'm speaking to you on the back of several years of real concerns being highlighted about state care and the treatment of Māori here in New Zealand. We've been dispossessed of our land, language, and culture. And just recently, people have been talking about language trauma associated with the forcible removal of our language, particularly from my grandparents' generation, and being disconnected from our whānau. And all this was replaced with Euro-Western worldviews and ways of being that didn't necessarily align well to our Indigenous ways of doing it. So in each of the countries, Aotearoa, Australia, Canada, US, and others, we have similar stories and similar histories that have played out in different ways. And even how those histories and stories have played out here in Aotearoa have varied from place to place. So understanding the histories of our Indigenous peoples, particularly in the area that you live, become quite important. Now it's frozen. So, you know, I like to think that colonisation has left a wake. It is still ongoing. There's a lot of debate here in Aotearoa that colonisation is something that has been and gone, but we still have colonising acts happening today. It was a violent event in Indigenous history. It involved invasions, collective traumatic events that have been etched into the psyche of generations of Indigenous people. We've had the forcible removal of our children. In Canada, you've got the children being moved into missionary schools. Here in Aotearoa, it was state care and into white adoption. These created soul wounds that span generations of family. So, you know, we need to recognise the varying places that people sit in terms of being Indigenous. So here in Aotearoa, I talk about people who have been fortunate enough to be raised in still a very traditional way with steeped in their language as their first language, to those who know they're Māori, but that's it. They don't know anything else because of the disconnection that their whānaus have been encountered. So the wake of colonisation still rocks and submerges our peoples, and it's made worse by the health and social inequities that we suffer. Avoidable hospitalizations, high rates of non-communicable diseases early in life, lower life expectancy than others living in their countries. Here in Aotearoa, that's on average 7.2 years less. High adverse experiences when you do get into health service, and on it goes. Basically, there's a lot of mistrust by some of our people about whether they will be looked after, and that leads to things like avoidance of health services and what have you. Coupled with that is the framing of Indigenous people by their perceived deficits, by negative stereotypes, and framing them pathologically. And so those perspectives are maintained by race and racism, and which are colonial tools designed to marginalise and exclude Indigenous people. And sadly, this flows over into our Indigenous nursing populations at times. And we also, but ironically, we know that if we can have Indigenous nurses that our people can connect to, this could make a difference in the outcomes of their health and well-being. So I just want to show this picture here. In the top left-hand corner is my grandmother's great-grandmother. And my grandmother's grandmother, and Hohi Paia Ngāpui, who was renamed Sophia McGregor when she married an immigrant from Scotland. I think this picture is quite ironic because here she is dressed in Victorian dress, but she's got the traditional kōwai moko or tattoo on her chin. And so I see that picture really representing the cusp of the turn of colonization here in terms of assimilation. But notably, she was a woman of status in the late 1800s. She was an owner of land, and she maintained her cultural links along the east coast of the North Island of Aotearoa. In the middle is my grandmother with my son, and I grew up with her telling stories of how her mother focused on making them good Pākehā or white women. And some of them were quite brutal methods to do that. So was the importance of assimilating. While I grew up with a strong sense of being Māori, I also grew up with an equally strong sense of knowing it was not good to be Māori. And I guess this was my first introduction to racism, but it was also recognising that there was something missing in us, that we didn't have the language, that we'd lost the connections with our cultural lands. And here I am down in the right-hand corner with my second mokopuna or grandchild, who we're trying to fiercely ingrain in them the pride of who they are. E tu wahine, e tu whānau is a study that we undertook around how Māori women keep safe and unsafe relationships in the face of the negative discourses that surrounded them. And I just want to share you with a quote from one of the women around why she didn't ask for help. In the face of non-fatal strangulation, repeated non-fatal strangulation and repeated severe head trauma. Why didn't I ask for help? I was unable to seek help. I was embarrassed, ashamed, confused, and didn't trust strangers, not helped by having black eyes and being under the influence of meth. The mere thought of going to organisations for help engendered a sense of dread and hatred. I knew I wouldn't be welcome, and the people in them were always quick to judge me. Besides, they've taken my kids away. The simple truth is, I didn't feel getting the bash or being scared. I felt totally vulnerable having to go to organisations to ask for help. And she had to ask for help because they were taking away her children. The other thing that I wanted to talk about too in this table summarises research done with Māori about their experiences with, sorry, I've just got a bit of a problem here, health services and looking at, environments that are not welcoming, ineffective actions with nurses and doctors, feeling marginalised, being treated in negative ways, being silenced, having to encounter disrespectful attitudes and behaviours, not being heard, having their needs not met. And I've got a student at the moment who's interviewed 44 young Māori, so between 16 and 24, and it's quite horrific how nurses have treated them, particularly not believing them and also not listening to them. So forcing one young girl to have a pregnancy test because the nurse didn't believe that A, she wasn't having sex, and B, she wasn't pregnant. And in another case, having surgery cancelled because the young person wasn't believed around having not taken drugs before surgery. But they noted that they get treated differently, racial discrimination and outcomes that aren't conducive to health, long-term health. So Indigenous nurses possess critical strengths and they have expertise, and they come with the added value of understanding the culture and the realities of Indigenous peoples. But here in Aotearoa, they often encounter racism on a daily basis, whether that's in the form of what people very liberally bandy about as unconscious or implicit bias, or microaggressions, or just blatant racism. It doesn't matter how smaller or insignificant an incident seems, they are cumulative in their effect. So microaggressions aren't so micro when you're experiencing them on a daily basis. There are also gaps in equity of outcomes between Indigenous nurses and non-Indigenous nurses. So we know that we have a problem with the retention of Indigenous nurses in our education setting, but also in our practice settings. But we don't know exactly how big the problem is, because the people who hold that information are not willing to share that, although that might change with the new system coming on board. They are often silenced and made invisible, yet are made to carry what Hara and Martin called a double cultural shift. So it's like the extra things. So they have their own work, but then they're asked to deal with all the cultural issues on top of it and called for their cultural expertise. And it's not often that our Māori nurses are asked to then go and sort out problems that have arisen because of situations that should never have happened in the first place. So I think, whether it's in schools of nursing and the education setting, or whether it's in the practice setting, or even if it's in the leadership and policy development setting, these three big forms of racism are evident. So institutional, or sometimes called structural or systemic racism, interpersonal racism that happens on that interpersonal level, and internalized racism. And we know that internationally and our local evidence links poor health outcomes to racism. So we don't have to be a user of health services to have our health affected by exposure to racism. And we know that our Māori nurses experience the stresses and strains of having to endure this in their daily work environments. It's a social justice issue. It's a breach of human and Indigenous rights. And quite frankly, I believe it's unacceptable. It causes significant harm to those who are the targets of racism. And it is recognised here in Aotearoa as a determinant of health. So that institutional racism, I do have to express some real concern, because what I'm hearing here is people say, oh, it's just systemic, or it's just structural racism. We need to remember that our systems and our structures and our institutions exist because of the people that are in them. And the policies and the way in which things are done are run by people who make decisions. So I think when we say, oh, it's systemic or it's structural, what I see is the people within the systems and structures being made invisible. So we need to look at it and look at what are the gaps between our policy statements, what we say we will do, and our actual practices, and where are the leverage points that we can affect some change. Interpersonal racism can be intentional or unintentional. We've got an elder here who says unconscious bias ain't so unconscious because that person was not lying horizontal and not aware of the world when they made a decision to act in some ways. I fundamentally believe that we don't get up in the morning and over breakfast decide to treat some people one way or and other people a different way, but it does play out in people's practice. And I think we need to be prepared to really interrogate that and think, why did that happen? Because our people tell us they notice how they're treated differently from other people. The other thing is acts of commission or omission. So it's not just something that you do wrong, but it can be something that you don't do. So we know that trying to engage with people face to face and have that sort of connection through engagement is a cultural imperative. It's something that you do. We have a pōwhiri process where people are welcomed and we get to know one another before we get down to the business. And but what we find is that people come into health services straight onto the business. They don't even know who they're talking to often. Sometimes they talk to the back as the health professional works, like a nurse or a doctor works on the screen. They feel judged. They don't feel like they're being listened to or given the opportunity to talk. So, and I hear our nurses talk in the nursing setting at times with similar sorts of issues. Furthermore, I think we need to look at what is our norms in our nursing environment that enables us to continue to treat people in those ways that goes against some of the values that as nurses we sign up to. And then I just want to mention about internalized racism that often reflects social values and systems of privilege, like white privilege, that erode away people's sense of value, and it undermines collective action. And for some people, they feel they're either not white enough or they're not Indigenous enough, because they've taken on board all the negative things that people have been saying. So we need to understand racism a lot better. I also believe that we should be valuing Indigenous nurses. So this is our last International Indigenous Nursing Research conference that we held, that was held in Ipswich, Queensland, just before our world took on a major change in our lives. And for us here in Aotearoa, clipped our wings from flying places. But this is a group of Indigenous nurses from various places: Central America, Australia, New Zealand, some of the islands, and I'm not quite sure if there was somebody there from Sami. Canada is there as well, and Aotearoa. So increasing equity and responsiveness to Indigenous health and wellbeing really needs us increasing our Indigenous workforce. Here in Aotearoa, I can speak that we have this rhetoric around increasing our Indigenous nursing workforce, but 4 decades down the track, we have made no real shift in that. Our Indigenous nursing workforce makes up between 6 and 7.5% of the registered nursing workforce. We are 16.5% of the population, and in some areas of New Zealand, up to 50% of the population are Indigenous Māori. So improving Indigenous nurses' experience is about improving cultural safety, which we have been talking around for quite some time, and the quality of care that is delivered to our people. So I see a challenge going forward is on 2 levels: the people who receive nursing care, but also our Indigenous nurses. We need to look at the silencing, the invisibility and the oppression of nurses. And here in Aotearoa, we do have a precarity in particularly in education, where our Indigenous nurses are oftentimes employed on casual or fixed term contracts. So there is little opportunity to develop an academic career. They have a burden of much higher workloads, so their own education gets put back on the back burner while their colleagues are progressing with their academic careers. Being an eternal squeaky wheel has done little to change that embedded structural racism in our nursing leadership. And more recently, our Indigenous nurses have bound together and have made some stands. But what the position and the oppression of our Māori nurses here in Aotearoa is really supported by interpersonal and structural racism. We have a system whereby we have token Māori sitting on committees rather than space being made for more than just one. And the problem with the token person sitting on these committees is it's much easier to silence them. So our nursing leadership in some ways are allies by stealth. And we really need to ask who holds the power and control, who gets to decide, who gets to act, who holds the resources, who is silenced, who is invisible, and what role does white privilege and white fragility have. And particularly when it comes to Indigenous health matters and Indigenous nursing. And we need to look at the implicit biases, discrimination, exclusion, and the microaggressions and the burden of representation that those who are our allies place on us. So, I just want to make sure how much time I've got. So equity counts. It is really important. We need to have equity in our nursing workforce, but in order to start making a difference for the equity that our people rightfully deserve, equity in outcomes. I mean, there was one person said, my first visit to the GP didn't even look at me, and that sort of put me off. They don't engage with their patients. They have their screen in front of them and they look at their notes and the records, and that's it. Now and again they say, you've got this, you've got that. That's it. See you later. And this person went on to say then how working with the nurse didn't get any better. So I think we need to think about things. And I want to say too, if you take nothing away, culture counts. Our worldviews influence how we see and understand the world. And we know that Indigenous people have a much more holistic, relational and connected view of health and well-being. And when you look at health and well-being, it doesn't necessarily include disease and illness. So we need to understand the behaviours and practices that guide health, such as the importance of spirituality and the importance of our whānau, our extended family networks that are so important for the well-being of Indigenous peoples. We also need to look at the establishment, the cultural imperative of establishing relationships, the importance of making connections, introducing who you are, where you're from, and why whānau should trust you. We also need to ensure that encounters where possible are face-to-face, although that's quite challenging in these COVID times. And where possible, continuity of cares, that knowing face is so important for people feeling like they're going to be listened to. We have a theory of change that is around transforming thinking and doing, and it's based on our creation stories. So Te Kore was this void of nothingness, but a void of potential and energy. And so this is around creating the conditions for change to transform futures. So what is it that you need to do to change the conditions to change the future? And then Taupua is the varying shades of darkness. So going from the darkness of dark that you can't see your hand in front of your face to the grey light that we can. So there's all these shades of darkness. And so the transforming conversations about what we know and do is about moving from the darkest of dark towards the light. And then Te Ao Marama, the world of enlightenment, is around thinking differently to create safe and mana enhancing practice for people. And so when we talk about mana enhancement, that's about increasing people's self-worth and esteem that they rightly have as human beings. We also need to move beyond Indigenous deficits and pathologies and start looking at what are the strengths that our Indigenous nurses hold and have that can make valuable contributions to not only the health and well-being of Indigenous people, but nursing practice in general. That's really, really important. And we need to recognise the collective way Indigenous peoples operate. So I know here in Aotearoa, our Māori nurses operate very effectively when we can get together as a group. And it's good for our spiritual well-being, our Waiora. We also need to look at how we foster culturally responsive practice. And so it is around nurses being culturally competent, being able to demonstrate culturally appropriate and acceptable practice. This doesn't mean to say that they need to be knowers of culture, but they need to know about themselves, about their own values and beliefs and how that influences their practice. They need to know about their own systems of privilege and their fragile points that make it difficult to change. But also, it's about knowing about what are the important things that I need to know when I engage with Indigenous families. The other thing is being about cultural safety. And here in Aotearoa, we had this wonderful way of practice that was going to change the world, and political and social forces sort of disrupted that. But, you know, all these decades down the track, we look back and say, but we still haven't got the metrics right. How do we know people are actually culturally safe beyond ticking the box on their practicing certificate? And our legislation now requires our regulatory bodies to ensure that our health workforce is not only clinically safe, but also culturally safe for working with Māori. But we've still got to get the measurements right. And I say that we haven't got it right because we've got no appreciable shift in the quality and safety of care of Indigenous people. The other thing is, working with Indigenous people and their whānau and thinking about equity and trauma-informed practice. So kai is a Māori word for food. And so we use kai as an acronym around the knowledge about ourselves and about our Indigenous people. So earlier I talked about knowing the history of the area that you work in, being aware of the contemporary circumstances for Indigenous peoples, the actions, what we do when we're working with families and people, and also how do we integrate their cultural needs and practices that they need while they are engaging with health services into their plans of care. And I think we need to practice with humility. So why have I got kumara, or you might know them as sweet potato? But we have this whakatauki, ka ore te kumara e whaki ana e tana rika. The kumara does not say how sweet it is. And so it speaks to humility, that we stand back and we look and we listen before we start talking about what we know and our expertise. So our practice must be beneficial. So by being humble, we can create space for Indigenous people to start sharing and develop trust. We need to recognise that Western-derived evidence is limited within cultural context and the everyday realities of Indigenous peoples. Culture and equity of outcomes ensure nursing practice is relevant and meaningful. We're very good at rhetoric, but not so good on implementing our professional ideals. So we need to explore the dissonance that exists. And we need to nudge our thinking and doing about working with Indigenous peoples. So my closing words are mā te rongo, ka mōhio. Mā te mōhio ka marama, mā marama ka matu tau, mā te mātou ka ora. Through listening comes awareness. Through awareness comes understanding. Through understanding comes knowledge. And through knowledge comes life. And so our Indigenous nurses are a taonga or a treasure to nursing practice, particularly when it comes to the importance of practicing within an Indigenous cultural context. So may the peace be widespread, may the sea be like greenstone, a pathway for us all today. Let's show respect for each other, for one another, to bind and bring us together. Kia ora.
Thank you, Denise. Dr. Wilson. I don't know if you can see me. Oh yeah, here. I can see myself, kind of, maybe. Okay, thank you so much. That was amazing. So we're all gonna virtually clap now. Thank you so much. That was so great. And I know it's really early there. So I'm gonna, we have a time for maybe a couple questions. So there's 2 questions online that we can answer, and then we're gonna take 1 question from the audience, and then we're gonna move into our panel. So I wanted to read you a question from Mona Bearskin. Dear
Yes.
Dr. Wilson, thank you so much for your presentation and sharing your life's work. In light of recent news here in Canada on voluntary self-identification, have you developed any strategies for supporting voluntary self-identification to ensure authentic positioning and self-location is accurate? Any specific accountability policies or measures you might suggest? What do you think our institutional responsibilities are in ensuring people are who they say they are?
I think this is really a really interesting question. And I guess up until, I think it was the 1980s here, we worked on blood quantum. And so you couldn't identify as Māori unless you were 50% blood Māori, which if you look at some of our whakapapa or genealogical trees, was like, how on earth do you work that out? But now we have self-identification as Māori. So as long as we have our whakapapa and we can connect, we can identify as Māori, recognising that there are some Māori whose disconnection is so great that it's difficult to get that accurate whakapapa. But usually we connect people with elders or holders of whakapapa, our genealogies, who can help people put things together. It's really interesting as to this whole issue of, are you really Indigenous and are you Indigenous enough? And is your colour the right, your skin the right colour sort of thing? We really don't, this is for individual whānau who can identify and make the connections, are able to, and are accepted as being Indigenous. It's not up for institutions to decide, and it's not up for other people who are not Indigenous to decide. This is about recognising that historically Indigenous people have been so dislocated from who they are. Reconnecting is not always a smooth path, but it is a really important part of people's healing, and healing from some of those traumas. So I recognise that there are people here who've been adopted out, over there who've been into missionary schools and have totally lost that connection to their whānau. we have people who belong to gangs who know they're Māori, who came from Māori whānau, ended up in state care and have been totally dislocated from their families and don't know where to begin. So, yeah, my answer is, this is an Indigenous issue for Indigenous people to work out. And I know that there are politics in Northern America around who gets to be counted as Indigenous, but that doesn't take away who you are in your bones. Does that help?
I'm going to answer yes, it does.
Right.
Because the person is online, but
Yeah.
thank you for your information and advice and thinking about that. Okay, so I'm going to ask if there's any questions from our audience, our live audience here. Yes, Annette.
Hi, Denise. This is Annette Brown.
Oh, kia ora, Annette.
Yes. Thank you so much for your discussion. And I'm wondering, in the current era of calls for EDI, equity, diversity, and inclusion, and in the context of new and evolving forms of liberal democratic racism, and the ways in which calls for equity, diversity, and inclusion map on to manifestations of liberal democratic racism. I'm just wondering what we as nurses can do, perhaps in the policy arena or in the healthcare arena, to point out this disjuncture and to move conversations forward in a way that's constructive and perhaps not blaming. And I'd just like to hear your comments on that, please.
I think, yeah, we live in interesting times, don't we? Where some of that like we're dealing here with some of that white supremacist type of ideology is now quite blatant, rather than sitting underneath the skin of our country. And what have you. I think, when there's several layers to this. One is, there's a lot of people that I've been engaging with in the Indigenous space who don't want to be named as diverse. They want to be seen as the people of the land. And not just lost in this big group of people who are known as diverse. So I think that's one thing. But the whole issues around what the issues that you've raised is, I think we have to, as a profession, have policies around some of these things, that if we're talking about the health and well-being of people, then we need to recognise that these episodes of, and I'm just going to call them racism, because that's usually, what they boil down to, are damaging for the people that they target. And we as a profession shouldn't be condoning that. But equally, we should be educating our nurses too on some of the historical things, on how some of these ideologies come to be embedded. I think, in recent times, I think it's born out of a dissatisfaction with people who govern our countries, and dissatisfaction with a whole range of things, but it's easier to place it onto people. I think the other thing that we need to do is that we need to have the various groups of people, like Indigenous peoples, have space to have their own voice. I'm increasingly concerned about some of our allies who speak about us on behalf of us, when we're quite capable of speaking on our own grounds. And so you need to ask the question of whose needs are being served. So yeah, we're dealing with issues. At the moment, we're dealing with anti-vaxxers who seem to be popping up at every Māori community where the Prime Minister is visiting to talk about vaccination and the policy around vaccination, to be disruptive and what have you. So we have, the consequence of this is, yes, people have a right to choose not to be vaccinated, and nobody denies that. But when you've got people who are fronting up with their vaccination, having panic attacks and so stressed they don't know if they're making the right decision, but they know that they need to get it for the safety of their whānau, because of all the misinformation that comes. So I think part of it is teasing out the misinformation that feeds some of those ideological standpoints.
Thank you, Dr. Wilson. That was great. And thank you for the questions. I wish we had more time for more questions, but we are going to switch into a bit of a panel now. So that will be great, and we can continue the dialogue. So I just want to again thank you, Dr. Wilson, for being with us here today and to share international perspectives. And for the symposium panel dialogue segment of today's event, we have also invited some panelists to share their Canadian perspectives. So I would like to now invite our moderator, UBC Nursing Assistant Professor, Dr. Saima Hirani, and panelist Tanya Dick to the stage to join our remote panelists. And our remote panelists today include Chloe. Okay, I'm going to forget her last name here. I have to find it. Chloe Crosschild, as well as Dr. Wilson. And we're very honored today to have Tanya Dick come, as well as a newly appointed to the UBC School of Nursing as our inaugural Indigenous nursing lead. And today is a great day for that. So thank you very much for joining us today, Dr. Hirani and Tanya. And I will now pass it over to Dr. Hirani to introduce today's panelists.
Thank you, Sabrina, for your kind introduction. And welcome to this afternoon, everyone. And special welcome to our panelists today. It is my pleasure to be moderating today's panel discussion. I'm really honored and excited to be here and to be engaged in this discussion because I'm looking forward to have an outlook to understand Indigenous realities and to learn and gain insights about how to improve our nursing practice and attitudes to generally improve the quality of care. So I'm really looking forward to our discussion. Without any further delays, I would like to introduce our panelists today. And we know it's a different kind of panel discussion. We have one panelist in person. We are honored to have you, Tanya, and two panelists online. So I would like to introduce our first in-person panelist, Tanya Dick. Tanya is from the Zawadinuck First Nations of Kinkum Inlet and has been a registered nurse in BC for 18 years. She's the first Indigenous person to graduate from the UBC School of Nursing's Master of Nursing Nurse Practitioner program in 2010. Her career has focused on rural and remote nursing, specializing in emergency and Indigenous health. Ms. Dick has recently been recruited to the UBC School of Nursing as the inaugural Indigenous nursing lead. Congratulations, Tanya, for your new appointment, and we are really looking forward to your meaningful contributions to the school. Yeah. Our second panelist is Chloe Crosschild. who is joining us virtually today. Hi, Chloe. Chloe is a Blackfoot woman from the Blood Tribe Kainai Nation. She is a registered nurse working towards her PhD at the UBC School of Nursing with supervisor Dr. Colleen Warco. Chloe was the inaugural navigator for a new Indigenous patient navigation service in Alberta, and she's currently employed as an assistant professor at the University of Lethbridge. Welcome, Chloe. And last but not least, our final panelist who is joining us virtually today, and we have all met her today, Dr. Denise Wilson. Dr. Wilson, thank you for your insightful presentation. It was amazing to hear you, and I'm looking forward to have your insights in this discussion too. So welcome again. Okay, so my first question from our panelists, and I would like to begin from you, Tanya. Since you are here, you know, I can see you face to face. We know we have a calls to action document by Canadian Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and in plain sight report that highlights the systemic racism in BC healthcare. We also know that unfortunately many Canadians lack knowledge of Indigenous history, and you know, maybe they're not aware of the contributions that Indigenous people have made to Canada. How do you think, or how does cultural responsiveness intersect with Canadians TRC and in plain sight report? And it would be great if you can just share with our audience just a brief overview of in plain sight report from BC.
Big question, thank you. I guess quickly, the in plain sight report was kind of commissioned by the Minister of Health around hearing a story of nurses guessing alcohol levels of an Indigenous patient in the emerge department. And from that came the call for an investigation, not only in that story, but overall kind of racism, discrimination, stereotypes in the BC healthcare system. So that was completed by Mary Ellen Chappelle-Lafon, and there's a number, I think there's 24 recommendations that came out of that. You did touch on the TRC recommendations as well. I had the honor of participating in some of the TRC stuff. My parents are both survivors of residential school, and got to travel around to the different testimonies and actually be there for the release of the report in Ottawa. Really involved in the investigation with Mary Ellen Chappelle-Lafon, particularly. Afterwards, I'm on the task force to kind of help implement those recommendations. I mean, just recently we were meeting this morning with some of the staff from the Minister of Health's office, and we were talking about the TRC's 94 calls to action, and really only, I think it's 23 have been implemented. And that's not a lot. And there's a lot of work going into trying to get the rest going, but it's been a slow process. It's been difficult. And I think it's, we're all really realizing we can't move these things forward unless we all together kind of step up to it. It's not up to us as Indigenous people. It's not up to the non-Indigenous people. We have to do this together. Yeah.
Do you want to shed some more lights on how cultural responsiveness, and I know Dr. Wilson has also talked about cultural counts, that it matters a lot, right? Would you like to shed some more light on it?
Like cultural responsiveness to the in plain sight?
Yes.
From a nursing perspective?
You can, yeah.
Well, I'm biased. I think nursing is the system. I think we are there. We're the largest number of health human resources within the system. We harness more power and control than we realize within the system. We're relied on left, right, and center, and responding to understanding and knowing what in plain sight is, what the investigation was, what the outcomes are, what the recommendations are. Those are tracks really easily laid down for us as nurses to follow, where we don't have to do a lot of the heavy work. And that comes from the voices of people sharing their experiences of harm and even death due to racism and discrimination when they're accessing healthcare services. So is there a duty to respond? There absolutely is. That cultural responsiveness, it's not a good idea. It's the law. It's a human rights law. It's the law provincially and nationally. It's within our regulatory bodies. And it's just the right thing to do. And we have to start collectively as a society, start seeing that no longer leaving people behind when it comes to healthcare services and overall health status.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you for reinforcing this understanding and the significance of, having that cultural competency generally as a Canadian and as a healthcare provider and nurses. Yeah, thank you so much for that. My next question is, I know, Dr. Wilson, you have touched upon the huge impact of racism against Indigenous people. There was a list of, and it was really eye-opening for me. I just wanted to go back and unfold some of the factors or forces that are responsible for this status quo. So maybe we can begin with you, Dr. Wilson. What do you think are the biggest forces in the healthcare system that perpetuate the colonial status quo until now?
I think fundamentally the way in which systems and structures are set up, and who gets, we have a system where everybody is entitled to free public health services, but the way in which the system plays out means that we've got a system that's generally full of the well-worried middle class. So the people who really need the health services, like our Māori Pacific and some of our other groups of people living in Aotearoa, don't necessarily get the health services they need until they get very sick and end up acutely unwell in the hospital setting. So we know primary care services are a real problem. I think what COVID-19 did last year, the government gave our Māori health providers resources in a high trust environment, a high trust contracting environment. And what was demonstrated was that those providers, because they knew their communities, they knew how to access the people and talk to the people and all the rest of it, were able to deliver services in a really timely manner. And they rolled out things in ways they knew would reach people. But that was a window of time, and so now we're back to business as usual. So we know that Indigenous people, like nurses, health providers, and the other health professionals that sit within that, can make a difference, but the system is set up in such a way that it makes that difficult to happen. I think the other thing is that there is such a low level of trust by Indigenous people, driven by deficit views of Indigenous people and what they don't have, the negative stereotypes, and the racial judgments that are made, and then the interpersonal racism. So when you listen to people who talk about really avoiding, fronting up to our health services, and particularly, including nurses, that they're going to get treated in a judgmental, disrespectful manner, and sometimes they talk about racist manner, it doesn't help. So those things make a big tsunami anyway. Do you know what I mean? They come together and they make that wave so big for our people accessing services. And so the status quo is allowed to persist, and it goes unquestioned, because the people who are being affected don't have a space to have a voice about what's wrong. So, but I think a big way around this is to start having good racial, race, ethnicity based metrics that are looked at, because when we look at how well is the health system functioning, and performing. When we just do the big picture, we miss out the realities for our smaller groups. So yes, we're nearing 90% vaccination rates here, but when you start looking at it, our ethnic groups, our Māori are lagging well behind in most places. So I think it's looking at those three levels, the systems, the people using the systems, and the people in the systems. Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. Chloe, would you like to share your thoughts from the Canadian context? What do you think are the biggest forces that are still holding the colonial status quo?
Great, yeah, I can. And I, again, can really only speak to my own experiences as an Indigenous nurse and an Indigenous woman accessing the healthcare system myself. But I think that through my practice anyways, I've learned that our healthcare system, the system really emphasizes these biomedical frameworks of care, and it's obscured the impact of the social determinants of health and the historical, socio-political, and economic factors that really affect Indigenous people's health. Because of this, it really points to the challenges that Indigenous peoples face, including things that have been talked about today, like individual and systemic racism. I found that there was a lot of inappropriate use of terminology and language by healthcare providers, knowingly and unknowingly, and the lack of communication. So I think really, though, the greatest challenge that I have seen is and have addressed in the past is this sort of mechanistic nature, specifically in hospital or acute care settings that really harbor the culture of paternalism and racism and privilege things like individualism and whiteness. A lot of those things go to impact Indigenous peoples in often a negative way. So a lot of times it's the culture that's harbored and the lack of people willing to challenge some of those practices or conversations. So I think that that's really one of the biggest things that I've seen in what I have done in my own practice.
Thank you. Thank you for your thoughts. Tanya, would you like to add something? We would love to hear you. No, just if there are any additional.
No, I'll just really echo what everybody else said. And I love the systems, the people in the system and the people, work in the system. So we have to look at it. We have to understand that from a nursing perspective. And when we kind of are in our positions, how do we project that leadership to engage in those different levels and not just on our patient, on our ward, on our floor, that our practice really has to have that broader view of everything.
Oh, true. I think all three of you have very well articulated that it's not like fixing one thing. There are many things, multifactorial things that are embedded and woven into our society at several layers, right? And this is how the outcome is, it's not easy to fix in one go. And I also appreciate the perspective that Dr. Wilson, you shared in your presentation about the universal lens, which is not going to work. And often, Indigenous racism is seen with the lens of multiculturalism, with the little or no acknowledgement of colonial operations. So this is, again, one of the things I think we should take into account. And I just want to remind our audience that this is one of the perspectives that had really resonated with me when I heard you and in our panel discussion that we had before today's event. Yeah. So now I would like to shift our gears towards solutions and strategies. I know it's hard to talk about in a few minutes, but just I was just wondering, Chloe, I remember when we were talking about this panel discussion earlier, and you brought up an idea of allyship. So I just wanted to have your thoughts on, can you explain what allyship is and why do you think it has potential to address this issue?
Great, yeah. So I think in order to talk about allyship, we have to really understand what an ally is and how I understand it. And I'm not an expert in the area or literature on allyship. So this is coming from a very, what I've collected and what I know today. But what I think an ally is somebody as a person who actively promotes and aspires to really advance the culture of inclusion. And that's done through intentional, positive and conscious efforts that really try and benefit the people as a whole in which they're trying to be allies for. So I think in order to understand that, then allyship is something that's been talked about. I know that there are different pieces of allyship. And one thing I think that we need to avoid is that performative allyship, where we're saying one thing, but our actions are not following. Allyship is really, it's a lifelong process. It's something that is of building trusting relationships. It's consistent. It's based on accountability with marginalized people or groups of people. And it's not self-defined. I think that that's really important. It's not something that, I can go out and say that I'm an ally for, or I'm demonstrating allyship. It has to be coming from that group or recognized from the group in which I'm working with. I think that's one really important piece that needs to be recognized. And I think that, as allies, we need to be actionable. So our words and actions must be in sync. To be an ally, you should be able to think about how you can advocate for the marginalized population or Indigenous peoples in this specific panelist discussion. Sharing of growth opportunities, recognizing those systematic inequalities and realizing the impact of things like microaggressions. You need to be able to believe the experiences of underrepresented peoples. I think that's a really big one that I've experienced myself, where I've had to have validation from non-Indigenous peoples to say, yes, that story is true, or that's actually what happened. That instance of racism was actually what happened. So I think that that's a really big piece that I see in nursing practice and in the healthcare system. And it goes back to what Dr. Wilson was talking about in terms of humility. It's being able to listen and support and self-reflect and be okay with change. It's, adapting your thinking and reworking what you believe to be correct if it's challenged. And I think the bottom line there is just really being comfortable with being uncomfortable, because that's the place where change happens. So that's sort of my take on allyship and being an ally. I'd love to hear the feedback of the two other panelist members here. So.
True. Yeah, thanks, Chloe, for just connecting it with our other panelists. Tanya, what are your thoughts on it? And maybe in your experience, have you seen any example or any story, if you remember, where you felt the need of allyship, or maybe you have seen any success with that?
I have experienced true, authentic allyship within the profession, within our nursing organizations. I've also experienced that kind of fake woke allyship that Chloe just talked about, that really causes a lot of harm. And I think I unfortunately have experienced that more than I have true allyship. And that's just been the reality of my lived experience. And particularly moving, I haven't just been moving through the profession of nursing and bedside nursing, just kind of up and down through leadership roles and political roles, and really getting out there with trying to have an Indigenous presence and voice that just kind of set me up for harm, really. And when people are telling me that we need to hear you, we need this, we need that presence, we need that voice, we need to make this change, and then you step into it and you're just like covering your jugular. So it's definitely, that's the culture out there. I think it's over the 18 years that I've been in this, it has shifted and changed, and it continues to. I'm finding more and more authentic allies, and where we actually are kind of truly in this together. And I'm also really learning, humbly learning that allyship is a two-way street, that I too have to be an ally as an Indigenous nurse to my nursing family, to the nursing brothers and sisters as well. So those are my thoughts on that, and thanks.
Oh, fantastic. I think that's a big message into it, right? That it's a two-way and a mutual way of running it. So yeah, thanks for that. Dr. Wilson, we would like to hear your any example from your experience of allyship that has worked.
I think we're undergoing quite a big change within our faculty at the moment, and we've got the ally. We've been creating allies with our faculty leadership team, and it's been a long journey over a number of years, but we have arrived at a place now where people see that we need to change the way in which we're doing it, and that how people wanted to change things and be our allies was actually drowning our Indigenous staff. So we have now got, I've got a male colleague who is Associate Dean Māori Advancement that sits alongside of me. So we come with different strengths. And we have over a year have managed to get agreed to that each school within our faculty now has an Associate Head of School Māori Advancement, which was initially just 0.2, but now is 0.5. So I guess I'm saying this is that we've got this group of allies now that finally understand how we need to change and how they need to support us to get that change. And so it's quite exciting, but we've got lots of work to do. And I think, Chloe, you've brought up all these qualities that you've identified that I think people sitting around that table can tick off. That group of people have also, who are not Indigenous, have also becoming aware of the people who have advocated that they are allies, but have been doing, some stuff that's not necessarily in our benefit. So I think, this is a journey that we go on, and but I think it needs to be a trusting relationship. It needs to have the action that goes along with the talk, and it's got to benefit the people. And it is about being uncomfortable, but it's taken us a long time and lots of conversations of very frank, put it out on the table conversations to have to get to where we are today. So I think allies are really important, but we've got to have true allies and people who are not going to silence us, but create the space and support us.
True. And this is good to know that you said it's well said that it's a journey and it's an ongoing process. But the good thing is that these dialogues and, having these relationships have started emerging. So that's a ray of hope, I think, in this, in the situation that we are going through. Mm-hmm. In the extension of, about the strategies and allyship as one of these strategies that we said, what other actions do you think can nursing organizations take to dismantle the Indigenous specific racism in healthcare settings? And Tanya, if you would like to take this question first and share your response with the focus of nursing practice with your experience.
Such a big question again. I think when it comes to nursing practice and our role in dismantling racism and discrimination within the system is, I think, just, from my own lived experience at the bedside, we get stretched too thin in our own practice where, we have more patients than it's almost beyond, it just pushes our capacity, and we're running and we're not taking breaks and we're not going to the washroom, and it just doesn't allow us opportunity to stop for a second, to take a breath, to reflect, to, you know, reassess kind of that kind of energy or culture within these interactions. It's like we end up being so task oriented that it takes away from the opportunity to do that. And how do we find time in our day of work to do that? Because I actually had 2 nurses call me after the report was released, and they were really upset, and they said, I can't do this. I can't do this. I can't take on any more. It's just too much right now. I'm face down already. And I'm like, I hear you. So collectively as a system as well, again, as you look at those layers, how do we allow our nurses to participate in that? We want genuinely hear from so many nurses that, what can I do? I need to be a part of this, and just kind of stuck on it. But the system they work in doesn't allow them to do what needs to be done to be able to reflect and change their practice or change their approach and see that. So that I acknowledge that, and I've experienced that myself, and I know what that feels like, but that's not an excuse either, because the outcome is tragic. People are dying literally because of it. So we have to find a way, and it really lies on the self-regulating profession. We have our standards. We have to find ways to do that. And if we need to support and lean on each other and reach out to each other to find those structures and systems and ways to do that, then that's what we have to do. But right now, as it stands, we're not being successful with this at all as nurses. It falls on our plate, and the system just drains us. So it's kind of it feels like a really rock and a hard place for sure. So we have to figure that piece out. Thank you.
Well said. I know this question is not on our list, but I was just wondering if there was one thing that, you know, if you were asked to suggest for a system to ease that burden, what would that be? No, I'm putting you on the hot. Yeah, but sorry about that. But just wondering, because you are there, you know, you see those nurses day and night.
I think kind of the geographical part of it, but I'll just follow the commercials that we see. We need more nurses. We need to produce more, we need to build and produce more nurses and get them into the system, but we have to build them competently. We have to build them where it's hardwired into them as students, where they learn this already, and it becomes naturally when they step into their practice. Not step into your practice and then think, oh my God, I got to figure this out now while I'm running hard. It doesn't work that way. So I think we're doing really well with many of the schools of nursing in the province are kind of really shifting gears and really kind of implementing into their curriculum and exposure to the nursing students. I'm seeing that shift over the past 7 to 10 years it's been phenomenal. We still got a lot more to do though.
Absolutely, I think you hit the nail. It's the most, I think ongoingly, this is the most common issue that the BC healthcare system is facing. And I think overall Canada's, right, with the overburdened nurses that we have in our system. Okay, so Chloe, what do you think, what could be a call to action in nursing education if you want to dismantle this racism at an organizational level?
That's a good question. I have just recently entered the realm of nursing education specifically. So I'm quite new in my role as an assistant prof here at the University of Lethbridge. But I think that I really think that and this is a point that was kind of brought up through Dr. Wilson's presentation and through what Tanya has also said today, is that we really have to diversify who is at every table, you know, whether it's, you know, a curriculum revamp or if it's, you know, any kind of, you know, council or places where we can, you know, bring that voice and privilege that Indigenous voice at the tables. I don't think that it is fair to have one person be the, I think it's flawed to think that one person can create that change, one Indigenous person. We had this conversation, I think, a little bit before, where I've found myself caught in those situations one too many times. And that it really comes from a collective approach about how we're seeing things. And I know it's not specific to education, but I think that just nursing in general, and the healthcare system in general, is that we harbor this idea of shame and blame. And I think that we really need to shift away from that. I think that we're all implicated, we're all affected, and really we all have that agency and that ability toward decolonizing nursing practice, education, research. I think that that was one of the big things that I saw, which, you know, prevented a lot of people from really standing up and speaking out against racism, was because, you know, it was very individualized. We wanted to point and blame one person who was at fault for, you know, for racism, and, you know, had this idea of dispensing with the bad apples. And once these bad apples have been, you know, penalized or reprimanded, then we're okay. We can continue on and we can continue doing what we need to do. But I think that that also prevents people from being bystanders as well. And so I think we need to harbor a culture within our nursing areas of practice and education and research that, you know, we are strongly committed to social justice, equity, and anti-racism. And we can support that through our leadership roles. And how we do that, I think, is going to look differently. I don't think that there's a cookie cutter answer that I can give you, but I think that it needs to be having those discussions with Indigenous peoples. I think that those peoples need to be at the table to voice what they need at that time in that context. So.
Well said, Chloe. Dr. Wilson, I would like to ask the same question from you, but with more specific lens to what you said in your presentation about producing culturally competent nurses is one of the answers to address this issue. I just would like to have your advice to nursing institutions and organizations. How can we produce culturally competent nurses in a real world?
Oh, very good question. And I'm just going to start at the other end and pick up on something that Tania said around the practice setting. And I think, you know, the socialization of nurses is a big thing that we often don't think about. So we can do lots of really good work in the education setting, but when people get into the practice setting, you know, as junior nurses, they tend to be pushed into conforming because, you know, people want to belong and they just want to do a good job and what have you. But I think somehow we need to engender a sense of strength in our nurses, and so that they are willing to practice in the way that they know that they should be practicing, despite what's going on around us. Because let's not fool ourselves that, you know, shifting this bus around is an easy job. And there are going to be initially some people who will jump on very, very quickly, you know, like it's like the waka, the canoe in the river. Some people will be on that waka, and that's really good. But you'll have a whole lot of people in the middle who don't really know whether they want to put their foot on or not, but they're quite okay where they are because it's safe ground. And then others who don't want to go there. And so a wise Indigenous nurse, when I first went into education, told me, don't spend lots of time on those people who don't want to change. Spend the time on those who are in the waka, because people will then come on the waka with them, and that's where you spend your energy, because we don't have a lot of time. I think too, we need to have a critical look at our nursing leadership, because the people who have been making the decisions, setting the structures, being the gatekeepers about who can be making decisions and sitting at the table are the same people who've been doing it for many years. And I don't want to be disrespectful to them, because I think they've been leaders in difficult times at times, and wonderful people with wisdom. But I think as we go forward, we need to really critically look at who sits at the table. And I said, to our Department for Prime Minister and Cabinet have got are setting up the new health system. And I was invited to a meeting there. And my advice was that we need to start looking at our young Indigenous leaders, nursing leaders, and because we have got some really wonderful Indigenous nursing leaders coming up, we need to be including them on those decision tables, and more than just one. We need a group of them because they're going to set the directions for us going into the future. They have a really good analysis and things like that. So I think we need to start shifting who are our nursing leaders in that space and make space for that. The other thing is that we've got to get our metrics right for performance around cultural competence, cultural safety, because I've been around. I lived through the birth of cultural safety, the political upheaval around it, the really nasty times, and come out the other side. And I fundamentally believe in it, but we haven't got the metrics right. And until such time as we can measure it, we will always go along thinking we're doing a good thing, but for our people, are we really doing what we should be doing? So we need to, I think, not just here in Aotearoa, but I think internationally, we need to be having conversations about how we get those, what are those metrics and how do we get them right? And I think we need to look at that notion of the cultural double shift, that excessive workload that our Indigenous nurses and educators sometimes are burdened with, and how if we're expecting them to do cultural stuff, then what else are we taking away from them? So the process that we've just been going through has been around, okay, so how do we not burn these taonga that we've got, these treasures that we've got, but support them for the benefit of the changes that we need to make in our faculty, which is the biggest producer of health professionals in Aotearoa. So it's a really important role. And so, additional time allocation's been made. We've looked at making those roles more strategic than operational, so they're not going to get into the nitty-gritty, and we'll look at other strategies to meet people's needs around the cultural issues. So I think there are some ways that we can start to shift the way in which we do things, which then starts shifting the climate about what's acceptable and what's not acceptable, about talking about racism and how people are inadvertently placing burdens on our Indigenous faculty. Yeah.
Excellent. I think excellent advices and suggestions, Dr. Wilson. And I think today's forum and this discussion and event is one of, is one of the pieces of your advices, right? At least we are talking about it. We are breaking that ice. So yeah, absolutely. Now we are moving towards our last question. And since we were talking about the suggestions and solutions, and universities are places that can play a substantial role in helping to close this gap for disparities in healthcare systems. And UBC has an institutional commitment to inclusion. And UBC School of Nursing is actually translating that vision into action. And we have many initiatives in place. Some of the examples are having Indigenous Cultural Safety Committee, Anti-Racism Committee, and Tanya's new role is a great example. So I would like to ask three of you to suggest something to the UBC School of Nursing, maybe one key message that you would like to give us for fulfilling this commitment of inclusion. And Tanya, we could start with you again.
Thanks. I guess I kind of feel it on the inside now. So I think if I could give one message, and it's probably something I've been saying all along, being an alumni and student here and experiencing this institution and having a fairly negative experience through my own Indigenous lens, and just allowing me to have voice and share that, just allowing me to stand in my truth. And I know for the most part, it's not comfortable. And I think it's been touched on earlier in the presentation that there's never going to be a comfortable moment in this, around this issue and this topic. So if we're going to have measurables, if you're not feeling uncomfortable, then you're not doing the work. So I just, that authentic space, allowing me to show up just who I am is absolutely vital. And allowing that space for the relationship with whoever I'll be working with in this role, that this is your work and this is your journey, and this is something that's needed desperately across the board, not just at UBC. And just be the leaders that you are and keep walking that walk. And I'll walk with you all the way if we're going to do it right. And we're in this together. And I don't think we're ever going to get any traction around the disparities and all of the stats and the data for Indigenous overall health status until we start figuring that out. That not much is going to move. It's going to be really, really difficult to move anything unless that relationship is there. So it's showing up and it's being authentic. And that's really all that's the most important thing for me.
Yeah, so excited to have you on board. Chloe, what will be your one message to the UBC School of Nursing? And I know you are associated with us, right? So
I am, yes. I also have that insider perspective as well. I think that the one thing that I do want to shed some light on that I've learned is a very important part of my journey as a nurse and as an educator and as a student is to try and find those safe spaces and places for Indigenous students, undergraduate, graduate students, where they can come together and lean on each other. Because sometimes you just need, I think, a space where like-minded people who have those similar experiences that you can just speak freely with and have those conversations and learn from one another. That has been the biggest and most important piece in my growth and my journey, is knowing that I'm not alone when I have these instances where I feel like I am, being questioned or I'm facing systemic issues, and having that ability to bounce those stories, those experiences, and sort of learn from other people who have been through that has been really the biggest part of my journey of growth. And so I think that having that sooner in my academic journey would have been, I think, really important for me to get to that place where I'm at now a lot sooner. And so that's what the message that I would like to send as a student and a person that has been through that myself. So
thank you. Dr. Wilson?
I'd like to say that there needs to be a willingness to listen with open hearts and minds to Indigenous nurses, because they have the solution, but they need the space, the resources and support. And just picking up on what both of you have said, Chloe and Tanya, we have like a whānau room on one of our campuses. And that is the safe space for our students to go, where they can be who they are. And it's a space where they can get food, support one another and rejuvenate. So I think that's really important. And I think, in terms of listening with open hearts and minds, as an Indigenous nurse, I would say that it's difficult for nursing to get much traction on some of the social determinants of health. You know, that's big picture stuff. It sits outside of it. It's politically and socially driven. But what we can make a difference on is the quality and safety of services. And if we've got, we're listening to Indigenous nurses, that is one way to go. We need to, in doing that, we need to critically review the metrics that we're using for success, and do ongoing monitoring of progress and performance, and have Indigenous people there who can speak to those in a safe environment, so that that you can move to the next level. So I think my experience is that we've been talking about solutions to this problems for many, many years, and we're still having the same conversations. We just haven't been given the space or the resources and support until this point in our history where things are starting to nudge around and change. So I would say, UBC, open your hearts and minds.
Thank you so much, all of you, for this rich conversation and valuable perspectives. I'm sure our future Indigenous nurses must be very proud and inspired by your talk today. So thank you. I personally enjoyed it. So I would like to hand over to Sabrina for closing remarks. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Wow, this has been a stand-up symposium and lecture, and I just want to thank you so much for coming and sharing and creating the space. And so with that, I just want to say thank you very much, Dr. Wilson as well, and Chloe, we miss you. And actually today on the panel was supposed to be Dr. Margaret Moss as well, and she was not able to make it. But I am really happy to see that some of our faculty are here, as well as the students. Specifically, we put out a call to have Indigenous students come together for a bit of a safe space. We're trying to create a safe space. So I hope you would join me now and provide us with your recommendations. As Saima had asked, the last question is, what can we do at the School of Nursing to make this a place that you belong and that you feel welcome and safe? And so with that, I just want to close, and I want to thank everyone for being here. And we're going to have a little bit of a small gathering for you to celebrate and share with us what your recommendations are, because we are truly wanting to have open hearts and minds, as Dr. Wilson has said. So thank you very much.